So let's have a look at some of those stories in more detail. How's the media discussing these issues around the world? So we start with the Washington Post and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying Israel is in possession of tens of thousands of documents which prove Iran lied about the history of its nuclear weapons program when it signed the deal in 2015. The New York Times is reporting on the twin bombings in Kabul that killed at least 25 people, including 9 journalists. It was the deadliest single attack involving journalists in Afghanistan since at least 2002 and one of the most lethal ever worldwide. The Guardian and many other newspapers in the UK is looking at the new UK Home Secretary, Sajid Javid. He's vowing to do right by the people affected by the Windrush scandal as he starts his new role. The Daily Telegraph talks about the music apps such as Spotify might give central bankers just as good a sense of what's going on in the economy as traditional surveys or traditional means of weighing up what's ahead. The chief economist at the Bank of England says apps like Spotify are key to gauging the mood of consumers. And the Financial Times says a painting sold by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York 5 years ago because it was deemed unexceptional is in fact a masterpiece by the Flemish painter Peter Paul Rubens. It's now being resold by its new owner for up to $5 million. I'm sure that was painful. We've got Oliver Cornock back, Editor-in-Chief of Oxford Business Group. Good to see you. So let's start with a story that you, I would imagine, have a lot to say about. This is that quite dramatic televised event on the part of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, where he sort of pulled the curtain across and revealed all this information about what Iran has supposedly been up to.
Well, the curtain came down and it was the files, and the second curtain, even more dramatic, came down to an array of CDs, DVDs of files as well. As you say, very odd, very staged. As we understand it, the US had met with Israel on Sunday to discuss this, so you can't help but think this is part of the broader build-up to Donald Trump's look at this Iran deal, which I think is on the 12th of May. He's going to make a decision.
Yes, it is, yeah.
And of course, one of the things that has characterised President Trump has been this particularly random approach to foreign policy. So rhetoric and this sort of stage-managed negotiation seems just part and parcel of that. Step back, though, and look at this more broadly, Sally, and it really is part of this cranking up the rhetoric around Iran. It's interesting, we've got the Arab News here, the Saudi paper, very interesting there. Arch rival Iran, but also in the past arch rival Israel. And of course, Netanyahu, in a sense, is being endorsed by what the Saudis are saying. I mean, a very odd reflection of power politics within the Middle East at the moment. The
question is, what will happen on the 12th of May? It's very difficult to know what President Trump might do, and it was part of Emmanuel Macron's mission to try and persuade the US to remain a part of this six-nation agreement with the United Nations and others to continue with the Iran nuclear deal that was brokered in 2015. President Trump speaking about this in a press conference yesterday, the press conference with the president of Nigeria, I mean, mentioning the fact that he said, yes, this was the worst. It confirms the fact I thought this was one of the worst deals ever.
He said it showed I was 100% right. And again, but to me, that's just part of the Trump way of doing things. Interestingly, President Macron of France, Angela Merkel of Germany, and Theresa May, the UK Prime Minister, met yesterday saying they want to fix rather than nix this deal. And I think that for all of us who watch this region, nobody wants to see any more destabilisation of the Middle East. Anybody who wants that, anybody who hopes that, is a very dangerous person in my mind.
But interesting on the part of the move by, President Netanyahu, or Prime Minister Netanyahu, well, he obviously clearly feels with, President Trump in power, he's got a voice, he has an audience, and he was playing to his audience, wasn't he?
And it was a real audience, a real stage.
Right, let's have a look now at the other story from the Middle East, and this is a story that was breaking about this time yesterday, actually, and very sadly, we lost one of our journalists, Ahmad Shah, 29-year-old BBC journalist based in Afghanistan for us. 9 journalists killed yesterday, up to 40 people, actually. Many children, over 10 children, 30 civilians, one of the deadliest days for some time.
Very deadly day for journalists, one of the worst days, of course, but in the broader context of Afghanistan, sadly. I hate to use the word normal, Sally, but it doesn't, it's just another bombing in Afghanistan, in Kabul. Particularly horrid in that the press, the security services had turned up to deal with the initial blast and a secondary device, an interesting modus operandi that we see terrorists using all over the world, absolutely grisly. Get the people around, rescuing people and then detonate another device, absolutely grim. What it does speak to, though, is that, the Taliban still control roughly 40% of Afghanistan. What with Islamic State now in retreat from the Arab world, they're being bolstered. It's looking very fractured again. Afghanistan really is one of the most intractable problems in the world at the moment. And it, again, sadly speaks
more so than Syria, you feel?
I mean, look, comparisons are odious, but you have to say in history, looking at Afghanistan, it's not been a homogenous state for a very long time. And one has to question what sort of peace deal could be negotiated. Of course, there was a peace deal in discussion with the Taliban, and that's fallen apart.
Indeed, absolutely. So we'll keep an eye on this, watch this space. Now let's have a look at the big story again. My top story yesterday was that Amber Rudd had resigned. At this point, we didn't know who the replacement was. Sajid Javid is the new Home Secretary in the UK. The Guardian, of course, has this on its front page. The Guardian has led with this story day after day because of the Windrush scandal. One of the first things he said in Parliament was that he will put that right. He said it's his top priority, as indeed he distanced himself from this idea of creating a hostile environment for immigrants within the UK, illegal immigrants or immigrants with questionable paperwork. Of course, Sajid Javid, a Pakistani Briton, I hate this word. We've seen BAME on Twitter a lot, black and minority ethnic. I wish we could move forward to talking about Pakistani Britons, to talk about Japanese Britons. America does it and integrated much better than we have. So this is a great story. This is a guy whose family came over from Pakistan in the 60s, a great success story, worked at Deutsche Bank and then went into politics. We really must hope that this enables us in the UK, whatever colour your politics are, to talk about immigration. That has been a recurrent theme. We talk about Europe being a thorn in the government side. Immigration is, and it needs talking about. So from your perspective, a very good choice in terms of the immigration story, but what about Brexit and what it means for Theresa May's cabinet? Because Amber Rudd was a very strong Remainer and to a great degree an ally for Theresa May. What about Sajid Javid? He is not so. Well, he falls loosely on the Remain side, so I think there'll be a nice bit of balance there. But it's going to be very interesting to see what he does say in public and whether he fits into this Brexit cabinet, which of course meets this week, a critical week. The government defeated in the House of Lords last night. Again. Absolutely. So Theresa May really does need a strong team around her. The evidence would suggest that Sajid Javid has good support. He has a good Midlands constituency in the UK. Again, importantly, going to draw in that ethnic minority vote, which the Conservative Party have found really hard to draw on, Sally. So really Theresa May presumably will be looking to that. As you say, the House of Lords rebellion again last night. I mean, basically it would seem that, the House of Lords is determined to enable Parliament to have its say about how we leave the European Union. Fascinating. Let's have a look now at the Daily Telegraph. It's got, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu on its front page. That's the big picture. But this is a really interesting story, and it's not just in the Telegraph, it's elsewhere. Reuters have got it, others have got it. How the chief economist of the Bank of England was talking about how they gauge the mood, as it were, what will affect consumer sentiment, what will affect our spending in the UK. And he's somebody that is known for his alternative views on things. This is Andy Haldane, and he's talking about looking at Spotify, what we're watching on the telly, what we're listening to on the radio, our playlist, to get a sense of how we're going to spend. On one level, it seems quite a whimsical story, doesn't it, to listen to music? But actually, if you think in the post-war environment, we saw some of these very upbeat, happy musicals coming out. Sentiment is very, very important. And for us that Oxford Business Group looks at economies around the world, sentiment is everything. Investors want to know about sentiment, and of course the high street in the UK particularly, really important determinant of figures. We're coming in to talk about interest rates and things like that. Sentiment is everything. So
consumer confidence, really important. If we can gauge that from big data such as Spotify, I mean, big data's come under a lot of criticism, hasn't it? But this is a use of big data in a really interesting, novel way.
Indeed. We shall keep an eye on what he's up to. And let's finally look at this this auction of the £5 million price tag on a painting that the Metropolitan Museum of New York decided was not particularly exceptional, and so they pretty much gave it away.
It seems to be that this picture
we all make mistakes, don't we?
This is quite a
Even
big mistake. It seems there are two sides to this story. I think that a lot of these pictures were, you know, these great artists had followers, people who were in the school of Rubens, in the school of Caravaggio. And so this seems to have fallen, according to the Met's assessments, into that, and then this guy's brought it for quite an inflated price above the auction lot price. It was a good 400,000 above. So maybe he suspected this buyer. We don't know who this buyer is who currently owns the picture. And finally, you know, the Met, if they have got all this experience, why don't they hold on to it for a bit and do some research? They don't need the money.
Well, I think they've learned their lesson. I think they have. Ollie, thanks for coming in. Good to see you. Thank you too.